Sirens wailed relentlessly outside Grady Memorial, but inside Chief Administrator Arthur Pendleton was busy terminating a lowly temp nurse for breaking his rigid protocols. He demanded her immediate removal, blind to her true identity, until the deafening roar of elite military Blackhawks shook his hospital, arriving strictly for her. Friday nights at Grady Memorial Hospital in downtown Atlanta were notoriously unforgiving. The emergency department operated as a relentless meat grinder, a chaotic symphony of crashing trauma carts, weeping relatives, and the sterile, sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with metallic copper. Amidst this swirling maelstrom stood Clara Bennett. On paper, Clara was just another temporary contract nurse assigned by Aya Healthcare to plug the gaping staffing holes in the city's busiest trauma center. She wore standard navy blue scrubs, kept her dark hair pulled back into a severe utilitarian bun, and possessed a chillingly calm demeanor that unnerved the younger staff. She didn't gossip at the nurses' station. She didn't complain about the grueling 14-hour shifts, and she never ever panicked. To the rest of the floor, Clara was a highly efficient mystery. She moved with an economy of motion that suggested years of intense repetitive drill training. When she started IV lines, she never missed a vein even on the most combative, dehydrated patients. Yet despite her undeniable skill, she remained entirely invisible to the hospital's upper echelon, exactly the way she preferred it. That invisibility was shattered at 2:14 a.m. when Dr. Arthur Pendleton decided to conduct one of his infamous surprise inspections. As the chief administrator of medical operations, Pendleton was less a healer and more a ruthless corporate hatchet man. He wore bespoke Italian suits that cost more than a resident's monthly salary and viewed the hospital solely through the lens of liability profit margins and strict bureaucratic protocol. Pendleton despised the agency nurses. He considered them overpriced mercenaries who lacked loyalty to his institution. He stalked the busy corridors with a clipboard, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his eyes narrowed as he actively searched for minor infractions to justify budget cuts. The collision between Pendleton's rigid world and Clara's quiet competence began when the double doors of the ambulance bay violently crashed open. Paramedics sprinted into the blinding light of the ER, shouting over the din. John Doe, mid-30s, severe blunt force trauma from a high-speed motorcycle collision. Blood pressure is tanking 80/40. He's actively circling the drain, folks. The trauma bay instantly swallowed the patient. Dr. Simon Miller, a brilliant but chronically anxious junior attending, took the head of the bed. Clara slipped quietly into the room, taking her position at the patient's right arm, her hands already moving with a practiced, almost mechanical fluidity. She slapped on the pulse oximeter, secured a massive 14-gauge IV into his antecubital vein, and began rapidly pushing fluids before Miller even had the chance to utter his first verbal order. From the elevated glass observation deck overlooking the trauma bays, Dr. Pendleton stood with his arms crossed, his cold eyes fixed on the unfolding scene below. He watched, waiting to critique. Down in the bay, the situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. The heart monitor's rhythmic beeping suddenly morphed into a frantic, erratic warning alarm. Pressure is dropping 60 over palp. A respiratory therapist yelled, desperately squeezing the bag valve mask. He's got a massive tension pneumothorax. Dr. Miller stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room, sweat beading on his forehead. His trachea is deviating. He's going into cardiac arrest. We need to decompress the chest. Get me a chest tube kit. Hurry. Doctor, a standard chest tube will take too long. He's losing his pulse now, Clara stated. Her voice was remarkably steady, completely devoid of the panic that had infected the rest of the room. It cut through the chaos like a surgical blade. He needs bilateral needle decompression immediately followed by a clamshell thoracotomy if we don't get return of spontaneous circulation. Miller froze. The sheer audacity of a temporary nurse contradicting a physician in the middle of a code was entirely unheard of. "Excuse me, you are a temp. You do not dictate the treatment plan. Get the chest tube kit." The monitor shrieked a flat, continuous tone. A systole. The patient's heart had stopped. Miller's hands visibly trembled. He stared at the flatline, completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming pressure and the rapid deterioration of the man bleeding out on his table. Seconds ticked by, precious, irreplaceable seconds, where oxygen-starved brain tissue began to die. The room fell into a horrifying suspended animation as the staff waited for their attending physician to act. Clara did not wait. Bypassing every single rule, protocol, and legal boundary established by the Georgia Board of Nursing and St. Jude's administrative bylaws, Clara physically stepped in front of the frozen doctor. Without a word, she snatched 2 heavy-gauge decompression needles from the supply cart. In one synchronized, brutally efficient motion, she drove them directly into the second intercostal spaces of the patient's chest. The hiss of trapped air escaping was immediately audible. Up on the observation deck, Dr. Pendleton gripped the railing, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. He watched in absolute disbelief as a contracted temp nurse illegally usurped command of his trauma bay. "Get out of the way, Simon," Clara ordered the attending, her tone leaving zero room for debate. She grabbed the defibrillator paddles, charged them to 200 joules, and delivered a massive shock. When the monitor remained flat, she didn't hesitate. She looked directly at Miller. "He's bleeding into his pericardial sac. If you don't open his chest right now, he is dead. Do it. Now." When Miller remained immobilized by shock, Clara grabbed a scalpel. It was the ultimate cardinal sin. She was not a surgeon. She was not even a physician. But she was not going to let the man die. The aftermath in the trauma bay was suffocatingly tense. Against all statistical probabilities, the John Doe had a pulse. Clara's violently unorthodox, entirely illegal intervention had stabilized the patient just long enough for the actual trauma surgical team to finally arrive and whisk him away to the operating room. Clara stood by the stainless steel sink, calmly washing the blood from her hands. She methodically scrubbed under her fingernails, her expression completely unreadable. The rest of the staff gave her a wide berth, looking at her with a mixture of profound awe and absolute terror. They all knew what was coming next. The heavy door to the bay swung open with enough force to crack the drywall. Dr. Arthur Pendleton stormed in his face, flushed a dangerous mottled purple. The veins in his neck stood out like thick cords. He marched directly up to Clara, ignoring the junior attending, who was still slumped against the wall in a state of clinical shock. "You," Pendleton hissed, pointing a trembling manicured finger inches from Clara's face. "My office, right now." Clara methodically dried her hands with a rough paper towel, tossed it into the biohazard bin, and finally met the chief administrator's furious gaze. She didn't flinch. "I need to finish my charting for the handover, Dr. Pendleton." "You don't have a handover!" Pendleton roared, his voice echoing off the ceramic tiles, silencing the entire emergency department. "You are finished. Do you have any microscopic idea of the liability you just exposed this hospital to practicing medicine without a license, assault on a patient?" "You are going to jail, Ms. Bennett." "My office. Now." 10 minutes later, Clara sat in a plush leather chair in Pendleton's expansive mahogany-paneled corner office on the top floor. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the glittering Atlanta skyline, but the atmosphere inside the room was venomous. Pendleton paced frantically behind his massive desk, furiously typing on his smartphone. "I am currently on the phone with the hospital's legal counsel, the state nursing board, and Aya Healthcare. You are not only fired, you are radioactive. You will never so much as look at a Band-Aid in a professional capacity ever again." Clara sat with perfect posture, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The patient was suffering from a massive tension pneumothorax, leading to traumatic arrest, followed by cardiac tamponade. Dr. Miller was experiencing an acute stress response and was completely incapable of performing the necessary life-saving intervention. I took the necessary steps to preserve the patient's life. The patient is currently alive. "I don't care if you cured cancer with a butter knife." Pendleton slammed his fists onto his desk, leaning over to glare at her. "We have protocols. We have chains of command. You are a temporary hourly employee, a replaceable cog in a very expensive, highly calibrated machine. You do not make executive medical decisions. Do you understand the multi-million-dollar lawsuit you just invited through my front doors?" Clara briefly glanced out the window, looking toward the dark night sky. She checked the cheap, rugged Casio watch on her wrist. 3:10 a.m. "You might want to reconsider calling the state board just yet, Arthur." Pendleton looked as though he had been physically struck. "Excuse me, you do not address me by my first name. You are a nobody, a reckless, arrogant liability. I'm having security escort you off the premises like the criminal you are." He aggressively jabbed a button on his desk phone. "Security, this is Chief Pendleton. Send 2 guards up to the administrative suite immediately to physically remove a terminated employee." He hung up a cruel, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "You can pack your locker under supervision. Then you are going to wait on the sidewalk for the police." Clara sighed, a sound of genuine exhaustion rather than fear. She slowly stood up from the leather chair, smoothing out the wrinkles in her cheap scrubs. "I warned you. I really tried to keep this quiet. I just wanted to do my civilian rotation in peace." Pendleton scoffed loudly. "Civilian rotation? What kind of delusional nonsense are you babbling about?" Before Clara could answer, a strange, low vibration began to emanate through the floorboards. At first, Pendleton dismissed it as the distant rumble of the city subway system, or a heavy freight truck on the interstate below. But the vibration rapidly intensified. The hot coffee in Pendleton's porcelain mug began to violently ripple, spilling over the sides and staining his pristine desk blotter. The low rumble quickly escalated into a deafening, percussive roar that rattled the heavy glass panes of the office windows. The framed medical degrees on Pendleton's wall began to shake, one of them completely detaching and crashing to the floor in a shower of broken glass. "What in the world is happening?" Pendleton shouted over the sudden, overwhelming noise rushing toward the window. Suddenly, the glittering city lights outside the window were completely eclipsed. A massive, terrifying shadow descended over the hospital's top floor. Pendleton watched in sheer, wide-eyed horror as the sleek, matte black fuselage of a heavily modified MH-60M Black Hawk helicopter hovered mere feet from his office window, the downwash from its massive rotors violently shaking the entire administrative wing. And it wasn't alone. A second identical Black Hawk flared out, setting down hard on the hospital's restricted VIP helipad situated directly above them. These weren't standard medevac choppers. There were no bright red crosses or hospital logos. They were painted completely pitch black, armed with advanced radar arrays and bearing the faint ominous stenciling of the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the legendary Night Stalkers. The office door violently burst open. It wasn't the two hospital security guards Pendleton had requested. Instead, 4 heavily armored military operators in full tactical gear carrying suppressed carbines stepped into the room. Pendleton backed away from the window, his face entirely drained of color, his jaw hanging completely slack. He looked back and forth between the armed commandos and the temp nurse he had just fired. The lead operator, wearing the oak leaf of a major on his tactical vest, entirely ignored the terrified chief administrator. He snapped to attention, looked directly at the unassuming nurse in the cheap scrubs, and saluted. Colonel Bennett, the major, shouted over the rhythmic thumping of the helicopter rotors above. "Sorry to interrupt your civilian leave, ma'am, but Joint Special Operations Command needs you. We have a classified mass casualty situation inbound to Andrews Air Force Base. Your surgical team is already prepping for transport." Clara calmly returned the salute, her entire demeanor shifting from a quiet temp to a hardened military commander. She finally looked back at Pendleton, who was trembling so violently he had to grip his desk to remain standing. "Like I said, Arthur," Clara said, her voice easily cutting through the chaos, "you can hold off on that paperwork." Stunned silence descended upon the luxurious administrative office, broken only by the rhythmic, deafening thud of the Black Hawk helicopter rotors slicing through the humid Atlanta air just outside the shattered window. Arthur Pendleton remained frozen behind his mahogany desk, his knuckles entirely white from gripping the wood. His perfectly constructed, heavily bureaucratic world had just violently collided with a reality he could not comprehend. He stared at the 4 heavily armed JSOC operators, their night vision goggles resting on their helmets, and then shifted his terrified gaze back to the woman he had just threatened to have arrested. Clara Bennett slowly reached up and pulled the cheap plastic Aya Healthcare temporary employee badge from her scrub top. She tossed it onto Pendleton's coffee-stained desk blotter with a dismissive flick of her wrist. The piece of plastic clattered against his expensive pen set. "Major Reynolds," Clara addressed the lead operator, her voice completely devoid of the deferential tone she had used all month with the hospital staff. "Status of the inbound casualties: 6 critically wounded personnel being medevaced from a highly classified overseas kinetic operation." Colonel Major Reynolds replied crisply, keeping his hands resting near his tactical vest. "Multiple gunshot wounds, blast traumas, and complex amputations. The Pentagon explicitly requested you take the lead on the surgical team. General Thomas himself authorized the immediate extraction from your civilian rotation." Pendleton finally managed to pry his vocal cords loose. "Colonel Civilian Rotation," he stammered, his voice cracking into an embarrassing high-pitched squeak. "This is a hospital. You are a temporary contract nurse. You cannot simply leave in the middle of a shift." Major Reynolds slowly turned his head to look at the chief administrator. The hardened operator's eyes were completely devoid of warmth. "Sir, you are currently speaking to Colonel Clara Bennett, the Chief of Trauma Surgery for the United States Army's Joint Medical Augmentation Unit. She is one of the top Tier 1 trauma surgeons on the planet. For the past 6 weeks, she has been participating in a fully sanctioned, federally authorized military-civilian partnership program specifically designed to keep elite military medical personnel sharp in high-volume civilian trauma centers. It is a program heavily modeled after the real-world Army Trauma Training Detachment stationed down in Miami. The major took a menacing step closer to Pendleton's desk. The hospital's board of directors and the federal government signed off on this entirely classified placement. Your complete ignorance of her true identity was by design to prevent special treatment. But let me be perfectly clear, she does not work for you. She works for the Department of Defense, and right now her country needs her. Pendleton sank heavily into his plush leather chair, his bespoke suit suddenly feeling suffocatingly tight. The arrogant, untouchable administrator looked entirely defeated, his mind racing to calculate the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic mistake he had just made. He had aggressively threatened to revoke the medical license of a high-ranking military surgeon, a woman who routinely operated under enemy fire to save American lives. "Arthur," Clara said, walking over to the coat rack to grab her civilian jacket. "When I stepped into that trauma bay tonight, I was not acting as a temporary floor nurse. I was acting as a sworn officer and a physician operating under the universally recognized doctrine of emergency necessity." Dr. Miller was acutely compromised by stress. If I had not decompressed that man's chest and initiated surgical intervention, he would be lying in your morgue right now, and you would be facing a genuine, indefensible malpractice lawsuit. She slipped into her jacket, her posture radiating an intimidating, undeniable authority that made the expensive office seem incredibly small. "I strongly suggest you tread very carefully with how you document tonight's events." Clara continued her tone, dropping to a quiet, dangerous register. "Because if I hear that you have attempted to punish Dr. Miller or smear my professional record to cover up your own administrative failures, I promise you I will make it my personal mission to expose every single dangerous budget cut and ethical violation you have forced upon this emergency department." Pendleton opened his mouth to formulate a response to somehow reclaim a shred of his shattered dignity, but absolutely no words came out. He simply sat there, a broken man trembling in a puddle of spilled coffee and shattered glass. "Let's go, Major," Clara ordered, turning her back on the chief administrator without a second glance. "We have soldiers bleeding. Time is tissue." The JSOC operators immediately formed a tight protective diamond formation around Clara. They marched out of the administrative suite, their heavy combat boots thudding against the expensive hardwood floors. They descended via the private executive elevator, bypassing the chaotic waiting rooms. When the elevator doors parted on the ground floor, the emergency department staff completely froze. Paramedics, nurses, and attending physicians stopped mid-stride. Dr. Simon Miller, still looking pale from the earlier ordeal, stood near the nurse's station, clutching a clipboard. He watched in absolute wide-eyed astonishment as the quiet, unassuming temp nurse walked confidently through the bustling corridor, flanked by elite Special Forces commandos carrying suppressed weapons. Clara paused briefly as she passed the young attending physician. She looked him directly in the eye. "You panicked, Simon," she said softly, yet loud enough for the immediate circle of staff to hear. "But your initial diagnosis was entirely correct. Trust your training next time. Don't let administrators dictate your medical judgment." Miller swallowed hard, slowly nodding his head in profound respect. Clara pushed through the heavy double doors leading to the ambulance bay, where a heavily armored tactical SUV was idling, waiting to transport her to the helipad. As the heavy doors swung shut behind her, the entire ER erupted into furious, disbelieving whispers. The legend of the mysterious temp nurse was already being cemented into Grady Memorial's history. Hours later, as the morning sunlight struggled to penetrate the heavy smog hanging over the Atlanta skyline, Arthur Pendleton was desperately attempting to salvage his rapidly disintegrating career. He sat in his ruined office, rapidly drafting a heavily redacted, entirely falsified incident report regarding the events of the previous night. He intended to frame the entire situation as a massive federal overreach painting, Clara's life-saving actions as a dangerous, rogue breach of hospital protocol. He was determined to protect his ego and his lucrative administrative bonuses regardless of the truth. However, Pendleton's frantic damage control was brutally interrupted by the harsh ringing of his desk phone. The caller ID displayed the private extension of Richard Montgomery, the ruthless chairman of the hospital board of directors. Arthur. Montgomery's voice barked through the speakerphone, entirely devoid of pleasantries. "Get down to the main executive boardroom immediately. We have a massive, unprecedented crisis on our hands, and the Department of Justice is currently waiting for you." Pendleton felt a cold, sickening knot form deep in his stomach. He smoothed his wrinkled suit jacket, grabbed his fabricated incident report, and rushed down to the boardroom. When he pushed open the heavy oak doors, the sight before him made his blood run completely cold. The entire board of directors was seated around the massive conference table, their faces grim and unyielding. Sitting at the head of the table were two individuals in sharp, dark suits displaying the unmistakable badges of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, alongside a senior official from the Department of Justice. "Ah, Arthur," Montgomery said, his voice dripping with pure venom. "Please take a seat. We have a rather terrifying development regarding the John Doe patient your temporary nurse saved in Trauma Bay 3 last night." Pendleton cautiously took a seat at the far end of the table, his hands visibly shaking. "Richard, I was just drafting the report. That nurse was a rogue actor, a massive liability." "Shut your mouth, Arthur," Montgomery snapped, slamming his hand onto the table. "That so-called rogue nurse was Colonel Clara Bennett, a highly decorated military surgeon. And she just saved this hospital from being completely dismantled by the federal government." The lead FBI agent leaned forward, fixing Pendleton with an icy, calculating stare. "Mr. Pendleton, the man brought in last night was not a random motorcycle crash victim. His name is Special Agent David Carter. He is one of our top deep cover operatives, currently embedded in a massive multi-state fentanyl distribution ring. He was intentionally run off the road by cartel enforcers who had blown his cover." Pendleton's jaw dropped. The room began to violently spin. Agent Carter had critical encrypted intelligence physically stored on a flash drive, hidden in his boot intelligence necessary to take down the entire syndicate. The DOJ official added coldly. "If he had died on your table last night because you were too busy worrying about liability protocols to allow a life-saving procedure, that intelligence would have been lost, and dozens of federal agents would currently be in lethal jeopardy." "I had no idea," Pendleton whispered, sweat pouring down his face. "Protocol dictates—" "Your protocols are a lethal joke, Arthur," Montgomery roared. "We reviewed the security footage from the observation deck. You stood there and actively tried to stop Colonel Bennett from saving a federal agent's life. Because she was a temp, you threatened to have a Tier 1 military surgeon arrested for doing exactly what your junior staff was entirely too terrified to do." The FBI agent slid a thick manila folder across the polished wooden table. "Furthermore, Mr. Pendleton, Agent Carter, was investigating a secondary angle. The cartel was utilizing stolen medical supplies from this very hospital to cut their product. Supplies that went completely missing under your direct administrative supervision, because you slashed the security budget to inflate your end-of-year executive bonus. Pendleton stared at the folder as if it were a live grenade. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He hadn't just fired a military hero. He had actively impeded a massive federal investigation while simultaneously running a dangerously negligent facility. "You are terminated, Arthur." Montgomery stated, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "Effective immediately. Security is waiting outside to escort you from the premises. The board is fully cooperating with the FBI's investigation into your gross financial negligence. You will be lucky if you do not spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary." Pendleton could not muster a single word of defense. The arrogant, untouchable chief administrator had been utterly destroyed by his own hubris. Two burly hospital security guards, the exact same men Pendleton had gleefully ordered to throw Clara out the night before, marched into the boardroom. They grabbed Pendleton by the arms, roughly hauling him out of his chair and marching him out the door in front of the entire silent board. 3 days later, down in the chaotic, noisy emergency department, Dr. Simon Miller stood at the nurse's station, diligently charting a patient's vitals. His hands no longer trembled. A delivery courier walked up to the desk, handing Miller a thick, rigid envelope bearing the official embossed seal of the Joint Special Operations Command. Miller carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a heavy, perfectly polished silver challenge coin, bearing the insignia of the Joint Medical Augmentation Unit. Tucked beneath the coin was a short handwritten note on heavy cardstock. "Dr. Miller, courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that the patient's life is more important than the protocol. Keep fighting for them. Colonel Clara Bennett, M.D." Miller smiled, a profound sense of pride washing over him. He slipped the heavy silver coin into the deep pocket of his white coat, feeling its weight. He looked around the bustling, chaotic trauma center. The sirens outside continued to wail, bringing in the broken and the bleeding. But the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The legend of the elite military operator who wore temporary scrubs had fundamentally altered the DNA of the hospital, reminding every single doctor and nurse why they had taken the oath in the first place. What an absolutely epic downfall for the arrogant chief administrator. Would you have had the immense courage to stand up and break the rules to save a life like Colonel Bennett did? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this thrilling true story of hidden heroes, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life medical dramas.